Chris Tocin and I know each other for the last 6 years, maybe, Chris?
Yeah, about that.
About that?
Yep.
Maybe 7 even. And we thought it would be good for us to actually walk you through an actual case study based on some of the work that Chris has shepherded at M&T Bank. And following that, we'll talk about some of sort of the key areas where you want to focus on, both if you're a financial institution and a bank, or if you're a reg tech vendor, what is it that you should be looking out for to help engage your project teams, engage your management, and figure out how you can actually get some of the funding for many of the projects that you actually need to do. So what I'm going to do is, Chris, I think the best way to do it is I'll just turn it over to you.
Sure.
And you could just talk about what's the magic sauce and what is it that you actually did at M&T that got you to where you are today?
Yeah, basically, if you just beg for money, they're just going to give it to you, right? Like that's pretty much the secret sauce. We started focusing a little bit differently at M&T Bank about our approach to spend. Approach to spend in the past in a compliance space has really been about how am I going to save on FTE? How do I put less people in the seats but still getting the same efficiencies that I do every single day? That doesn't work anymore. That model doesn't work for regulators. That model doesn't work for how you're trying to do red flag coverage in the compliance space, especially in AML. So it's more about how do I use resources to expand my risk coverage across the board. So one of the things, and the best way to explain how we sort of approach this is give an example. If I have a scenario in AML that's looking at high-risk funds transfers to or from different geographies, and that scenario is just not effective, right? I'm not creating any stars out of it. I'm just having a bunch of false positives. I have the ability to turn that scenario off. There's nothing to say that I can't turn that scenario off. So it's not about turning the scenario off and look at I could save 10 FTE at the end of the day. It's turning that scenario off and saying, hey, senior management, I could start looking at cryptocurrency trading. I could start looking at how we have IP address coverages. I could look at different red flags that we know we're lacking on and use those resources for different aspects within our organization. So that's the approach that we're really taking. There was one part of it to the secret sauce, though. We got under a written agreement, right? So you get under a written agreement, you're going to get the focus right away, but that focus only lasts for a certain period of time. So how are you going to continue to have that momentum? We, in 2012, got under a written agreement. At that point in time, technology spend at M&T Bank for AML was around $260,000 a year. I'm surprised there's no gasps in the room. And last year we spent $10 million. We're going to try to get $10 to $12 million again this year. So we're really taking our approach on that. To kickstart all of it, and Vishal was a big part about this, both at M&T when we worked together and with Protiviti, is we needed to bring in folks from the outside to say, where are we being inefficient, right? Our transaction monitoring models, our customer risk ranking models, where are our downfalls? And it came down to us specifically is understanding our data, right? If we have bad data, everybody's probably heard garbage in, garbage out, right? So being very, very inefficient in our programs because we didn't understand our data. We didn't have the knowledge that we need to have with the data, and we couldn't really even tell you how it flowed through our systems. So, Protiviti came in, did some validation on our models. We were able to show where our gaps were, where we were dropping data, things along those lines. And what it turned into was a big initiative around data within our organization. Developed out the Enterprise Data Office. Specifically in the AML space, I actually have a team that's just focused on data and how our data works. And it's really putting us at a spot to look at future state innovation and focus on our efforts on, hey, if our data gets better, we create efficiencies throughout our organization. As we create those efficiencies, we're not necessarily looking at kicking FTE out or things along those lines. We're looking at how can we increase our coverage. So, Vishal, I'm sure you have some experience there in other space too with other FIs, et cetera. So maybe you could go into that a little bit.
Yeah, Chris, and I think it'll be interesting to hear more from you after I just talk a little bit more about that. How did that really change the mindset of the organization? So sort of, I'll let you think about that for a second.
Sure.
And I do think that there's sort of three main factors that we are seeing at other organizations similar to M&T. The first one is, and Chris was very sort of absolutely right in mentioning data. The second is all about governance, and Chris will talk a little bit more about that. How is the adoption that you can actually get? And the third one, which is also kind of important, but quite honestly, it's not looked at that much, is starting small. Because everyone likes to go big bang, and sometimes big bang doesn't work. In fact, almost big bang doesn't work in many instances. And think about it from a pilot perspective, and start small. Figure out what's the ecosystem of different vendors and solutions that you're trying to work towards. In fact, Chris and I were talking about earlier, many a times, a lot of the banks get asked about what is the product that you need to install. And it's not really about the product, it's about the solution, right? And a solution equals product A plus product B plus change in processes, data, analytics, et cetera, all put together to figure out what that solution would look like. So we're seeing a lot of that. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, a lot of our clients would come and ask us, how many more people do I need to solve this problem? And now the discussion has changed because they probably have a lot of people. So they're like, how can we be more efficient? And what are the solutions that you can bring to the table? Or what are the solutions that we need to think about to be more efficient in this space, right? So gone are the days of let's throw bodies at the problem and figure out how we can solve this problem. It's now become efficiencies, effectiveness, and partnerships, right? But it all starts from the top. So Chris, curious to hear, knowing the issues, knowing the consent order, what was it that really changed the mindset of your board, of your management team to move it forward?
To be quite honest with you, I think it ended up being semantics, right? It was presenting the problem to our senior management in a way that they could understand what was going on. We were running super inefficient 2 years ago in transaction monitoring space, and for those of you in AML in this room and transaction monitoring, you'll probably, this is where I might get the gasps. On average per month, a year and a half ago, we were running at about 80,000 alerts a month. Those 80,000 alerts would turn into about 2,000 cases. You can do that ratio in your head. It's not very good. At a rate of about 300 SARs a month. We started really looking at our data, looking at the efficiencies of our program, and cleaned up our data, really did some analytics around the rules and scenarios that we were running to get some red flag coverage. And to date, we ran the report yesterday, I now have around 30,000 alerts a month, 2,000 to 2,500 cases a month, and more SARs. So I'm running a more efficient shop, but I'm making my investigators better investigators, right? 80,000 alerts to 30,000, and then 1,500 cases to around 2,000, 2,500. It just tells the story, right? That the things that we're doing around data cleanup, around analytics, robotics process automation, I'll get into that a little bit, how we're doing that, and then future state with machine learning and artificial intelligence, it proves the hypothesis of the things that we want to do is working. Mm-hmm. Cleaning up our data, getting better at address data, reducing our false positive rates. It takes your investigators from triaging and checking the box to being able to actually do your subjective investigations, right? Getting better at that. Looking at cryptocurrencies, being able to look at my referrals from my branches more in depth, working more with law enforcement. We've had the ability with some of the efficiencies that we've created to get law enforcement in the room and actually work with them on, hey, here's cases we're seeing, or what are you guys seeing coming out of New York City or Buffalo or wherever it may be, and then we get to, you get to show your investigator at the end of the day what they do is fruitful. So that's really been the case, is showing the wins. So robotics process automation, I'll go into that a little bit. So we've spent, I think the last time we did our study, we spent about 60 to 65% of our case time in data gathering, right? We have bifurcated systems. We have 17 source accounting systems. We have an enterprise party hub that acts as our master data management for our customers. We have a customers ranking application. We have to do Google searches. So basically, when our bank-wide transformation processes said, who wants to try robotics, we would raise our hands first. Why not be the guinea pigs? Let's see what happens. If anything, we're gonna learn what doesn't work or what works. We expected around a 50 to 60 minute per case save. We didn't get that good. We got about 20 minutes a case, right? So a lot of people would be like, oh, that sucks, that's a failure. Do the math. Vishal and I were just trying to do it in the back. It didn't work very. My dad always said never do math in public, so I'm gonna try though. 20 minutes a case, 2,000 cases a month. Okay, that's what, 40,000?
40,000.
Times 12 months,
480,000
480,000 minutes a year. Divide that by how it works, and it's about 10 months in save overall. That's a significant amount of time. If somebody wants to talk about money, sure, that saves me 1 FTE. But you know what? What it does for me is, when I said earlier, I could get cryptocurrency. I could start doing IP address verification things. So I get better at where my red flags are at the end of the day by being able to do that. So robotics has been great. We've run into a couple hiccups with it, Google searches, some third-party verification things. But if anybody has questions on that, we can talk about that at the end. But that's been a big win.
Yeah.
So then going into future state innovation, right? I've been able to prove how analytics, cleaning up my data, and robots have allowed me to create efficiencies within my part of the organization without reducing FTE, but also at getting better at investigating. Well, how else can I do that from a future state innovation? Robotics is the next process that's coming into, or not robotics, sorry, AI is the next space that's going in it. 5 years ago, I have a conversation like that around future state innovation with any senior leader of the bank, and not that the idea gets shot down right away, but it's almost a roadblock, right? Well, we've never done that before. We can't dabble in it. We don't have the money. Well, now I could prove out the incremental steps that we've taken with new technologies, how it works, and where this future state is going to put us. Mm-hmm. So we're able to start really having those fruitful conversations with, with Protiviti, with other reg techs that are doing this type of technology, and we're really in a spot that we could actually have the conversation and budget for it. Yeah. That conversation never happened before. So when you're talking with senior leadership, or you're having conversations about how what you're doing with technology, and what you're doing with your spend, and what you're doing with analytics, and what you're doing with data, that costs a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. But it ends up being fruitful at the end of the day because it's protecting your bank. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about the FTE. Don't worry about the money saved. Don't even worry about the money spent to start off. How are you protecting your bank? Because now I get to say, hey, give me $10 million for the next 35 years, and I still won't spend as much money as you did in the last 5, trying to get out of a written agreement, right? That was a significant uphill battle that we had. So that's sort of how we sold it, and having those conversations and teaching your senior management what risks are there in the AML space, in compliance space. The knowledge share, the better you could teach those folks, and not that they're just getting negative reinforcement from the regulators, negative reinforcement from the shareholders, you name it. Show them some positive reinforcement. We have actually done something fruitful with this. We present to senior management once a month around actual investigations that law enforcement went out and arrested somebody that was doing drug trafficking or human trafficking or terrorist financing. That knowledge share, people start to perk up a little bit, right? Instead of their heads in a deck, they're looking up and engaging in those conversations. So think about the approach. Don't worry about just how it's going to save you money, mm-hmm. how it really focuses on the coverage and the risk adverseness that it creates by putting you in that space. And that's how we've done it so far, and the approach has worked so far. They haven't kicked me out of the bank yet. So, yes, it's been good. So, Vishal, maybe you could go into a little bit more, since my background on the machine learning and AI and future state innovation, of where you're seeing sort of the industry going, how people are using it, and how people can start to execute on it in a small way.
So I'll just paint a picture real quick based on that question. I was actually going to talk about it in a different context, but based on machine learning, I'll actually talk about that a little bit differently now. So think about this. Chris and I are both in the anti-money laundering space, so most of the examples that we're giving you are based on anti-money laundering. It doesn't have to be just applicable to anti-money laundering. It's universally applied to any place where there's an operational function, where there's redundancy, there's a lot of people doing the same manual tasks, and there's the concept of the swivel chair, right, where you're actually going in and looking at things in different systems and pulling that information over. So historically, and even a lot of banks do it right now. Actually, one of our clients is a global bank, and they have to actually go and look at the KYC, which is Know Your Customer related data. And they have to do periodic reviews, which I'm pretty sure M&T has to do as well. And here's how the process works. Investigators log into their computers. They log into 8 to 15 systems, depending on whatever that particular application is and the risk of the customer. They pull the data in from those different systems. They type it in a Word document. Then they go in and put that information from the Word document into a case management tool. And then they actually do the act of investigation. And the act of investigation is finding out if that customer has changed from what the information the customer gave before, and is there any suspicious nature. Now, this process, even though it sounds simple, and I think you hit some parts of it before, 60 to 85% of this is non-value-added manual tasks that are being done by individuals. And this is about 100 to 150 investigators in a shop which actually are doing this day in and day out, right? Think about the inefficiencies in just that statement. It just is mind-boggling, and a lot of people are doing it right now. This is what banks do. There's an army of people who are performing these investigative tasks where 85% of their time is non-value added, right? So fast forward to some of the points that you're talking about. Think about some of the efficiencies that you can get by leveraging some of the newer technologies out there, whether it's robotic process automation, which I know is not new, but still a lot of banks are adopting that right now. Think about pulling some of the artificial intelligence or machine learning related behavioral patterns for the customers and having those behavioral patterns already start triggering, is there any nuance or any deviation from the patterns that I'm seeing for that customer? And working with whether it's OCR technology or natural language processing technology to pull information from these various databases, read the differences, go and do some internet searches and figure out if there's any nefarious activities on that particular customer based on the last time you talked about it, and pre-populate all of that in a case management tool or a Word document, right? So what I'm basically saying is by putting some thought around the process up front, 85% of the work that's done by humans today, and I don't mean this in a bad way, I basically mean that it's not necessarily value-added work, let me put it that way. The non-value-added work that are being done today, 85% of it, can actually be automated. And tools exist today. We are working with a lot of people, a lot of different banks to help them understand how they can actually go about doing some of this. And it's really not that we have any special information or a tool that we work with. Protiviti is a consulting firm. We actually leverage the knowledge that we already have gathered by partnering with firms such as Performline and other vendors and other RegTech firms that exist in this marketplace, and we pull them together with us, right? So we are building this solution or capability and helping the banks understand what the next steps are going forward. And it all comes down to one mindset, which I think is important, and that's all about innovation, right? The whole concept of, are you okay to fail with some of the things that you do and kind of fail forward and pick yourself up and move forward, right? So we're seeing a lot of that, especially in the top 20 banks. M&T is one of them, of course, and that's actually moving down into the second-tier banks as well, and I would say that's banks who have asset size between 50 billion to maybe 100 billion in asset size. We are seeing that happening as well. In fact, some of the smaller banks, which are 50 billion and lower, they actually have an inherent advantage because they have not implemented the big systems that some of the bigger banks have. And actually, they are probably leapfrogging across and saying, maybe we can partner with the RegTechs. Maybe we can partner with some of these other machine learning, robotic process automation, natural language processing firms in a way that will allow us to actually get better because we don't have to undo some of the work that we have done in the past, right? So think about that for a second as well. There's an inherent advantage where perhaps the smaller size bank would be more open to have some of those discussions than the cities of the world or the M&Ts of the world, et cetera, right? And to that point, I'm curious, Chris, if you in particular or the bank has started thinking about innovation and partnering with other such vendors and perhaps thinking about it as, it's okay to come up with solutions that might not succeed the first time, but let's try it out anyway.
There's a new saying at M&T Bank. It used to be if you see something, suspect something, say something. Our new saying is fess up when you mess up. Failure is encouraged because you learn, right? The whole approach to money laundering is you're never gonna catch everything, right? But you can't be negligent doing it because otherwise the next time I talk to you guys, I'm going to be in jail on a phone, which is never good. But so we're having the ability to have those conversations and really talk with future state innovators in this space. Now, here's the tidbit I'm going to give to any RegTechs that are out here or any other consultant firms that are out here. Don't come to me with a solution. It's not going to work. Come to me with understanding where my problem is. So I manage right now really 3 different technologies. Customer risk ranking, which is very mature at M&T Bank right now because of the written agreement. Transaction monitoring, which we are in the process of going to an entire new platform. So I don't even have time to think about efficiencies in that right now. All I really care about is going to the new platform. But where I really struggle is in my OFAX spot, right? I get a ton of false positives. One little change in data in my enterprise party hub can totally destroy my output, and then we have to get temporary resources, et cetera. Come in with the question of what is your problem, right? First meeting is always what is your problem. If you come to me with a solution, I'm gonna tune you out right away because you and Joe and Charlie all have the same solution and you're just telling me in a different way. Let me tell you my problem. Listen to me. Don't give me an answer right away. Come back in a month. Tell me how you could fix my problem. Because if you just come in with a generic pitch, chances are I'm already thinking about that. Or I don't have the money for that. Or somebody else has already beaten you to the punch. So be in a spot that you could really understand the issues that are going on in the day-to-day operations of these folks, and you're going to put yourself in their shoes. A little empathy goes a long way. So that's the approach that I would give you guys, and looking at this stuff in a completely different way is really going to go a long way. Don't look at it specifically of I have this many alerts, I need to get down to this many, I need to increase my SARs. It's not about those efficiency ratios anymore. It's about methodology, and it's about coverage. And the more you could drive that home with not only the folks that you work with, not only the consultants that you work with, but the regulators, we team up on them instead of them teaming up on us, it might actually go somewhere. So if anybody's got ideas on that, let me know. So I would love that. But that's really our approach. So Vishal, I'm not sure if you had anything else to add there, but it's a simple solution. Change the semantics, change the dynamic. You never know where those results could get to you. Vishal said earlier, start small. Don't go for the big bang. Start with one proof of concept, one hypothesis. Know your data, understand how that data is going to help you get to an end result. I'm telling you, those little small wins turn into something big at the end of the day.
Last question. We have 30 seconds before we open up for questions.
30 seconds, there we go.
So the topic of today was winning the battle for budget, right?
Yep.
So we've talked about how you got there. In 30 seconds, are you still winning, and are you still making inroads that you need to make?
We're in budget season right now, so I guess I'll find out. No, we feel pretty confident with the partnership we have with our senior management of the things that we want to do. And sort of our strategic focus. It's no longer focusing on what we have to do to meet the bottom line of the regulators. It's what can we do to stay ahead of the game and ahead of the curve moving into the future. So it's really the approach that we take, and hopefully, knock on wood, it continues to work. If not, I'll be calling somebody up here for a new job.
Well, I think this is perfect. We are at time. So what we're going to do is open it up for the next 5 minutes for any questions that you might have for Chris or I.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, oh.
There we go. I got a mic.
So I represent Silicon Valley Bank, and some of the issues which you mentioned around a significant amount of false positives and very little throughput in the OFAC space is very relevant to us.
Yep.
Just to give you a high-level overview, we have multiple sanction screening systems. We are in the process of consolidation, and we are thinking through how can we solve the problem of excessive false positives. Mm-hmm. Speaking to multiple vendors, but want to understand your perspective from a bank, in case you've spoken to somebody, and any thoughts around how can you address this problem of excessive false positives?
So I'll start off. The very first approach we took was around data, right? It was as simple as that. M&T is extremely risk adverse to the point where if there's any missing data element in any of our data, that data element goes high risk. The example I always give is on wires. 8 parties on a wire. If one party on that wire doesn't have a country code, that whole wire is going high risk. It was creating a ridiculous amount of false positives within our environment. So we focused on the data first. The very next thing that we did, and I'm simplifying that, right? That's a huge undertaking. For those of you that are in the banking industry and you've had to go through the New York State DFS Part 504, hopefully you feel a lot better about data, because if you don't, then you have other issues with 504. But that's a huge initiative. The second is we focused on scenarios that were very, very inefficient for us, right? So looked at those scenarios where we're producing a lot of alerts without any SARs. Now, in order to turn that scenario off, I still have to prove that I have that red flag coverage somewhere else. So we just took a different approach. Instead of just, it used to be turning off a scenario was a big no-no. You can't do it. Your wrist was slapped immediately. Now we look at it, like I said earlier, from a methodology standpoint. Yeah, I'm going to turn off my high-risk geography scenario, but I'm going to start looking at high-risk transactions over a certain dollar amount, a new scenario that says the same red flag coverage. So we looked at holistically from a methodology standpoint, but the data was a huge driving factor of how we reduced our false positives. It was enormous. Hopefully that answered your question.
Sure, but I guess the examples you gave were more befitting from an AML standpoint, turning off scenarios. But when you're talking about economic sanctions, OFAC, or whatever the sanctions might be, you're trying to identify names, and yes, data quality is an issue, and that creates false positives. But you also have the limitation of name detection algorithms used by different products, as well as whitelisting, ignore list, post-processing rules capabilities offered by these different vendors. So, short of that, have you seen any Reactive solutions around this space in terms of helping reduce the false positives?
Yeah, so, I think there isn't like a silver bullet for sure, but there are definitely some techniques and some solutions that we have seen. We can definitely talk offline about that as well. But it does start with data, right? And I'll give you an example. Let's say that your interdiction software for figuring out OFAC requires 10 different data feeds, because you need PEPs, you need negative news, you need OFAC screening, you need maybe the FASB records, whatever it is, right? Every time you get Vishal Ranjane out there with a misspelling, you're going to get 4 different alerts. And those 4 different alerts need to be acted on by 4 different people, or hopefully you can consolidate it with one person, right? There are applications in place right now which allow you to think about those 4 as one, and even before the alert is generated, it does the sort of triage for you behind the scenes. So inherently, even if you get a false positive hit, you're getting 1 false positive hit for 1 person versus 1 false positive hit because it hit against those 5 different data sources that you had. And the interdiction software obviously doesn't know better, so it's going to create 4 times the same instance, right? So that's one. The second thing is I would emphasize, and Chris started this by mentioning the whole concept of model validation or validating your scenarios. And that's important because a lot of times there's small tweaks that you can do to figure out if the homonyms or the synonyms or whatever the different trends are that your interdiction software is doing, is that capable to do it or not, right? So, and we can talk more a bit later. I'm conscious of time, and I would, maybe ask for another question as well.
And just to add right there, we haven't touched sanction screening yet, so our false positive rates are still the same.
So the good news is Chris is looking for sanction screen solutions as well.
Yeah, that was a pitch. If anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, let me know.
I think we might have time for one more question.
If anybody has one.
If not, we can come back to you. Good? Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
There's a question. Oh.
I have a question regarding the GDPR. The GDPR is coming up, the new regulation rule. So for a financial company who has a lot of client data in that instance for a global company, what's the recommendation for the company to comply with that regulation? Because to reduce the cost, most of the financial company, they try to move the data to the cloud. And it's not affordable solution to build the data storage in every single country. So a lot of companies, they kind of have data replicated. They have the primary data storage in one region, another, and they replicate it all over the world. So in that instance, do you have any recommendation to address that?
You could take that. My GDPR familiarity is terrible.
Well, I'll just say one thing. I mean, it's definitely a problem that's been faced by a lot of people, especially because of the point that you raised, that the data is replicated in multiple sources. And it's not just about turning it off once, but figuring out where it needs to be turned off and what's the impact of it. And again, it comes down to sort of building your project plan, if you may, for addressing GDPR in such a way that you're really holistically thinking about all the different areas and countries as well as soft systems that your data is actually touching, and have a remediation plan which is probably ubiquitous across the different regions that you're working in. A lot of companies are still struggling with it right now as we speak. They do have plans in place, and they're working towards it, and some of them are actually perhaps sitting back and waiting to see what happens when the regulators come back and do their screening and their examination. But I'm pretty sure that it's not something that's going to be solved in totality this year itself. There's going to be remnants of it going forward. Starts with a project plan, starts with knowing your data and moving it forward.
Thanks, all. I mean, obviously, we're going to be around for a little bit, so if anybody has one-off questions, let us know. And Alex, thanks for inviting us here. It's a good time.